And yeah, so that's my focus is on sort of implementation rather than only on the design of policies, but really also how policies are implemented, how they're actually carried out in real life, and what does that mean. And this is where, you know, I'm very interested in the work of civil servants, in the work of bureaucracies, and because I think this is really where a lot of things very often actually stop or change, or even if the ideas are good, they are implemented very often in different ways and so on and so forth. And I think many of us in this room also share this kind of sense that, yes, we can talk about directionality of innovation, but then when you go to a innovation agency, when you go to a city government, well, we talk about correct procedures, we talk about legal mandates and legal frameworks. That, of course, is rightly so, because that is what we expect from governments. We expect governments to work within the legal frameworks, to have transparency, accountability, not corrupt, right? So I think we have this inherent juxtaposition or conflict. We want more directionality from innovation. So if you invest in innovation, it should help our societies to be more equitable and more climate friendly. But at the same time, this is a very challenging task for actually implement in a meaningful way. I think there's another really interesting challenge. So this is a research from UK's National Audit Office. So this is the national audit office that looks at government spending programs. And you see that 80% of big government programs, nobody really knows whether they work or they don't work. But we know that they're there, they're kind of working, but we don't know whether they're actually really effective or not really effective. And that's, of course, comes from the fact the way we design policies very often, that we design a major welfare policy, for instance, and then we evaluate it maybe 3 years, 5 years. We do a kind of like an often external evaluations. Academics or other institutes like labor unions might be involved, and then sort of give that evaluation back to policymakers. But many of them, of course, have moved on. They are in different departments or they are elected out of office. The problem of learning is one of the key challenges in implementation, or when we look at the policy from the implementation perspective, is that we very rarely have a very good sense of what is working and what is not working. Of course, also the same goes for innovation policy. There's a wonderful handbook of innovation policy impact edited by Jakob Edler and others. It came out, I think, 8 years ago. They really looked at all sort of different R&D industrial innovation policies. What they pretty much showed was that academically, almost all policy measures can be seen to work and not to work. It all depends on the context. In other words, it all depends on other policies around a specific tax credit or whatever you have. So if you just want to have one policy and think you can solve industry or an urban social technical systems, it will never work like that. So you always have a complicated policy mixes. In other words, again, it's very difficult to know what really works and what doesn't work. And so it hints or tells us that we have a major challenge in learning in policy organizations. So how do we learn that if you want to do innovation policy or industrial policy, how do we know it is actually working? That, I think, is a key challenge. There's another really interesting question from Dan Hill, who used to work for Vinnova, Swedish innovation agency. He's actually, by background, he's an architect and a designer. And he worked he was hired by Vinnova, an innovation agency. When he got there, he was like surprised, why are innovation agencies not actually innovating? They're giving money to companies to innovate, but not themselves engaging in how do we change, for instance, complicated, complex urban systems like mobility. They're not part of that. They're supporting others to do it, but not themselves. And I think that's another really important lesson in that policymakers are often quite removed from sort of the actual innovation, structural changes. And that again tells us our learning as civil servants or those organizations is removed. We're learning almost by secondhand, like secondhand smoking. I guess you still learn something, but not as much. I think this is where the challenge comes from, that we very often do policy as a waterfall. So we design a policy in the parliament, in the ministry, we discuss with labor unions, with industry, and we let it go. We give it to the world to implement, and only we come back to 3 or 5 years later, see it work. Very often, as I said, means that we actually really have no sense whether policies are working at the moment. We know only hindsight when we analyze them. So we have this lag or gap in policymaking, and I think, as you will see, I think this is one of the key challenges in European policymaking, lag in learning. And so this is where sort of the key idea from the book that I showed you comes from, this idea of agile stability, that government organizations, particularly in innovation, have to do two things at the same time. So they have to provide this stable support for industry, for universities, because you can't change it. So even if you want to learn, you can't change it quickly. So universities are relying on government funding. Educational institutions are relying on government funding. So you can't just say, well, we don't support anymore whatever, medicine. You can't just do that because a lot of people rely on that. But at the same time, you need this agility. You need to learn what actually works when we are transforming urban systems in Vienna, for instance. What works, what doesn't work. So how do you combine these needs to be stable and agile at the same time? And as you will see, I think this is one of the key challenges for European Union policymaking in innovation spaces, that there is almost too much stability and too much agility at the same time, and hence the conflict or ineffectiveness of European policymaking. And for those of you who are interested in theory, you can look at it from the Bavarian or Schumpeterian perspectives, but I don't need to go into that. But there's a wonderful book by Dan Bresnitz, who's a Canadian innovation scholar. He argued that a lot of this agility into innovation systems comes from more peripheral, smaller agencies that are consciously built not on Bavarian bureaucratic lines. So they are built out of civil service systems, things like that. So if you're interested in that background, you're happy to look at it. I won't go into the detail of this, but just to show you that what we try to sort of theoretically build in the book is to actually this understanding that if you want to have both the stability and agility in the innovation system, you need actually different kind of organizations to do that. You need organizations that are supporting stable functioning of sort of your innovation economy. But then you need also agencies that are consciously trying to learn something new. So they are much more looking at agility. So they're trying to experiment more. They're trying to have more engagement in different ways. Again, you don't need to go into this detail, but here's what sort of where the main idea also for this paper comes from, that we actually need to build consciously organizational landscape, includes different organizations. I think today it happens kind of randomly. Cities create policy labs or urban labs. Governments try to create sandboxes. There are all kinds of things happening, but there is no sort of conscious design. Why do we do it? We very often build those new agile organizations because we see that the existing Bavarian organizations are not working. We try to do something new outside of them, but we don't have like a conscious design that, yes, we need these different kinds of organizations to fulfill different functions and different requirements. That is, I think, the key point. I won't go into that, but I think what we looked again in the paper as well, that historically, the book that I mentioned goes 200 years in the history of capitalism, and we look at the very different kinds of innovation agencies that do actually very different roles. Some of the agencies are very directly involved in funding science. Others are actually regulating industry. Others are creating overall policy rules. Very different agencies, very different forms. But again, I won't go into that. And again, another real sort of the key concept I use in the paper is this idea of public sector capacity. When we think of different organizations, different types of organizations, they have different types of capabilities and capacities. I think this is what we want to see in the system. We want to see a sort of innovation agencies that are supporting, let's say, basic scientific inquiry, which is very long-term, needs long-term sort of vision, but also long-term support. We have to provide 7, 10, 15-year programs to support that. And of course, within that, you have lots of autonomy. But then you need also policy programs that are maybe looking ahead at 3 months, 6 months. They're learning in a different space. They need much more of what we call the sort of dynamic capabilities of actually redirecting and rethinking of what we do. And so how do you do that? So when we get to European Union, and this is sort of provided you the analytical framework to analyze essentially what is happening. As I said, I think that in innovation policy, there is a well-known European paradox, which says that Europe has a very good basic science, not so good innovation, that something gets lost somewhere in the middle, right? It's a well-known discussion. I think there's another kind of European paradox. This is that there's too much stability, too much agility at the same time. And what I mean by that is, if you look at them on the level of European Union, so European Union is very happy to develop these quite broad frameworks like smart specialization, like mission-oriented policies, and then let member states figure it out. Kind of, here we kind of like missions. You go and do it. Like Austria is now trying to do Estonia, my home country. UK, when we were part of the European Union, we tried. Everybody's experimenting with that. So European Union is not telling you how to implement that, but when it gives money, it tells you very strictly how to implement it. So you have this experimentalist framework. Seems like very agile framework, but actually the way it is implemented is often very rigidly providing you a very rigid framework. If you use EU funding, you have to do certain things. And you can't pivot, you can't change in the middle of the program. So that's why, particularly if you look at regional funding and cohesion policy funding and things like that, EU has a lot of rigidity, ironically, in this sort of a broader experimentalist framework. I think there's a lot of this, what we can call new public management or waterfall style of policy design and implementation in the European Union. On a high level, there's a lot of experimental space, but actually when you go down and look at the implementation, it is very much here's our policy, we have to do it our way. I think this just means that there is very little, very quick learning happening in EU programs. That's why often EU programs are implemented through specialized agencies, focus on EU funding, for instance. I think that is not very useful because you can't really iterate policies. You don't learn as you go. Again, you learn at the end, you evaluate and do a new round of policy, new 7-year programs. And then on the other hand, I think there's on the regional and the city level, there's almost too much experimentation. Lots of pilots. I'm sure Vienna has its share of pilots, or any Austrian city, many of them supported by European structural funds or cohesion funds. And a lot of those pilots don't lead much. They remain pilots. There's not enough learning either to say it didn't work. You can say also pilots don't work and say, well, we don't work. Or there's little scaling from pilots and saying, the scale from that worked in one city now in Vienna, a solution for mobility, let's scale it across Austria. Rarely happens again. So you have lots of agility, lots of learning, but actually not enough. So I think this is sort of the main point of the paper, is to say that this is the European paradox in implementing policies. You have to somehow solve this. Otherwise, you're always in this cycle of designing relatively well-intentioned good policy frameworks that are then implemented in a quite rigid way. I just wanted to show you that there is this, wide-ranging practices and organizational frameworks if you look at detail. And again, this is a lot of information, so I'm sure you're not meant to solve it, but just to see that if you look at this type of new organizations and new policy approaches emerging, as I said, you have like challenge prizes, technology prizes, hackathons, sandboxes, policy labs. There's also like around digital teams. These are all almost predominantly created outside of the existing organizations or at the edges of them. But also, in our procurement, it's one of the key sort of areas where you also have lots of experimentation. So it's not like we don't try to do a lot of those things. So there's a lot of things actually happening. But my point is that there's much less of orchestration of these sort of organizations, the level of a member state, the level of European Union. I think there's if you look at those new sort of existing practices, there's lots of common elements. If they're effective, if they work, usually you have a strong leadership, there's a political will behind it. If you look at the city level, or if you look at the country or organization level, it has to be a strong sort of managerial skills. But also, there's very much a focus on trying to shape directionality of socio-economic systems, socio-technical systems, markets. So there's an open challenge to sort of the market failure frameworks. There's also a lot of mixing of analytical methodology. We very often do policy analysis driven by or based around some sort of economic analysis. If you look at, for instance, a lot of the policy labs and challenge prizes, They work much more with qualitative, social scientific, anthropological tools and design, policy design, user-centric design tools. So there's lots of epistemological variety coming up. Again, we realize that if you only do sort of economic analysis of policies, the learning is too slow. So we actually want to go to clients, to citizens, to users. We want to learn more quickly, because the idea is that if we do like a new social policy program, for instance, we should not do it for everybody at the same time. We should maybe start with 100 people, then go to 1,000 people, then go to 10,000 people. If you want to learn, is this actually an effective way of solving the problem? But that requires you to have a much more diversity in approaches. There's also, you can see there's a lot of the new sort of ways of building those organizations are purposefully trying to engage more, and try to engage outside of big industry, big university, try to go outside of these kind of not only industry or companies, but we try to particularly reach population groups maybe that are not the part of your usual innovation discussion. We talk about Asian society, we talk about migrant populations. There's lots of diversity in our populations actually that the usual innovation discussion does not capture. So how do you go there? For instance, if you think at the European countries context, all of our countries are aging. We need actually lots of new services. All of them have a technological component for an aging population. How do you actually? It's probably not a good idea if a 30-year-old is designing policy for a 60, 70, 80-year-old. So how do you engage them? Becomes more and more important. But also there's lots of experimentation, bottom-upness. So the idea that you try to actually have something that is smaller, experiment on the level of streets, of cities, of towns, and so on. And there's also realization that we sort of, when we talk about social policy issues or sociologically, we never really solve problems totally. Those problems are evolving. Societies are changing. There's no silver bullet. So we have to always continue to learn and iterate. And I think that's, again, goes against sort of the logic of economic analysis-driven policy analysis. Economic analysis very often tries to find sort of the final silver bullet, the policy that really, really works, best policy. I think that's not really there. Yeah, I think there's lots of also conscious building of those new, more dynamic capabilities in organizations. I think that one of the key issues is actually that these new organizations are trying to have a hands-on relationship with innovation. So you actually have civil servants who are actually engaging in the innovation with themselves rather than taking the hands-off position. And I think that's why they are often at the edges of your sort of. I think there's a interesting research coming out of Utrecht. There's a really, really good research group looking at what does it mean when we ask civil servants to transition social technical systems. I think they have given a really interesting sort of transition task, and I think some of them are really interesting, like how do you destabilize the unsustainable? And we all sort of realize that around us, there's some of the social technical systems are quite unsustainable. All of our food systems, for instance, in our Western European context, produce a lot of carbon, and the way we sort of manage our agriculture and agri-food systems is very unsustainable. But how do you destabilize that? If that's inherently a political task, or a civil servant or a public organization, because you are changing sort of the political economy, societies. And I think this leads us to a lot of interesting questions. So how do we actually change the way we educate civil servants, the way we actually think about civil service and public organizations in general? I think I won't go into these things so much. I don't want to running out of time, I think. But I wanted to show you that I sort of argue in the paper as well that how to say a kind of like a hybrid type of bureaucracy emerging in a lot of the European countries that takes the sort of the existing civil service kind of a Weberian core, tries to add lots of new neo-elements. And a lot of these new neo-elements have to do with methodological variety and diversity. So you don't want only people in civil service who have a legal background or economics background. You're trying to hire people, say, like service design background, come from humanities. So you try to have much more diverse groups, and to try to be much more engaging, open to society at large. Do you figure out new ways of engagement? So, and how do you do that in a team? But at the same time, we try to focus on societal challenges rather than just think about business R&D, think about technologies, but actually think about how do we actually solve those challenges. So these are more like new elements. Those organizations. I think at the end, so if you know your Weber talks about two types of ethics. One is the ethics of conviction, the other is the ethics of responsibility. He, of course, was very much supporting this idea that civil servants should focus on the ethics of responsibility. What is our mandate? What is our responsibility? But I think today we see that as important is what do we actually believe in as civil servants. If you want to motivate civil servants to really work on good for the good of society. So, and as we are moving into much more diverse societies with different religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, it actually becomes more and more to find this, what is the ethical purpose of our organizations, and provide people who work in those organizations with meaning. I think that's why the challenge-based working organizations are so appealing to many civil servants, because it provides them with ethical or belief systems that we are doing something that is very meaningful for societies, because we are trying to transform bigger systems. And I think that's a really interesting element. Here's, I think, a quote from Christian Patient, who used to run one of those early organizations in Denmark, Mind Lab. He said that shouldn't only build those small labs and sandboxes around government, big organizations, but all of those government organizations should think of themselves as labs. That they can do both things, that they can provide those stable services, infrastructure, but also learn quickly how those agile. In terms of Europe, I think there's lots of European Union. As I said, I think there's a lot of need to have a much more conscious design around public sector organizations, to think about what do we do on the level of Europeon Union, what do we do level on the member states, how do we actually design those organizations to complementary work with each other, have those capabilities across the system. And I think there's probably too much information here, but I think there's a need for almost like a meta-governance of those innovation agencies. Somebody takes charge of that landscape and thinks where are and what skills do we have, how do we get there. And yeah, so this is a final slide that I think we should think of the public organizations as a garden. You know, every good garden has a lot of variety and diversity, and that's what makes it beautiful. You have to design public organization landscapes as gardens, that not there is only one tree or one flower, but there's multiple. There's biodiversity in the organization. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time.